Hello. Welcome to this recording of a presentation of the history of the Marathon County Fair. My name is Ben Clark, and I am the archivist and historian here at the Marathon County Historical Society. This is a presentation that I did about 2 years ago, back in 2018, for the 150th anniversary of the Marathon County Fair, or as we know it now, the Wisconsin Valley Fair. This was created as part of our History Speaks lecture series, which is a lecture series that we do every month or so. We have an expert come in and give a talk to anyone who wants to come in. It's a free event. It's pretty successful. I'd like to do at least one of them every year that I'm here. As I'm recording this currently, it's 2020 and we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has meant that we've canceled these events this year, at least for the next month or so, and probably a little bit longer. And we've had to close and take all of these steps that is necessary for public safety at this point. But unfortunately, has meant that we are no longer able to put on these talks and some of our other programming. So we decided, hey, this is a good opportunity to maybe go back and record some of these presentations that we've done in the past, which would let us, show them to new people and preserve them for posterity. So this is what this is. I'm recording this to a completely empty room, which is a strange experience, I have to say. But we'll make do, and hopefully you'll enjoy it when this is all done. After I'm recording, at least. So, as I said, this is the history of the Marathon County Fair. I should say, if you are not familiar and you just stumbled across this video somehow and you don't know where is Marathon County, well, we're talking about Marathon County, Wisconsin, which is sort of right in the center of the state of Wisconsin. Sort of the main city here would be Wausau. It's our county seat. That's if that helps. But yeah, we're right in the center here. We're the largest county in Wisconsin by landmass, and so that's where we are. As sort of a consequence of that, a lot of land is actually farms. Agriculture is a big part of our collective history, as well as our culture and society here up to this day. And so it makes sense then that we have a fair that's been a big part of that life. As sort of a showcase for the agriculture. But it wasn't always that way. If we go back to the very early years here, when we start to settle this part of Wisconsin, Americans start to move in here initially to harvest lumber, right? Big Bull Falls, that was what the city of Wausau was known as before it was the city of Wausau. And that just referred to the location on the river, the Wisconsin River, where the rapids were really strong. And it made a great opportunity, great place for a mill to be put there to power the mill. So as the lumberjacks went out and cut down trees during the winter, they would stack them by the river. And then as the spring thaw, they would ride that water down, take the logs and take them all the way down to a place like Wausau, which would then cut them down at the mill. So that's kind of what you see here, these rafts that are made out of logs coming down the river. So yeah, like many places, we get built pretty much on the lumbering. But obviously we move past that, right? This is not Big Bull Falls. This is Wausau in 1865. By this point, we are Wausau. We're not the Big Bull Falls. And the county itself has been established, and we are moving out of that. We're not just, we start to think of ourselves not just as a community up on the Northwoods, someplace at the frontier. And now, the frontier has been pushed, and we've civilized the area, and we're a city that we should be proud of. It's not just lumber. We've also got banks and churches and schools. We've got everything. We're sort of moving towards being a modern, up-to-date city. And sort of within consequence of that, there are some interesting problems that emerge for the early county fathers and mothers, I guess, the founders. One of those happens to be a consequence of the lumbering. So not so much the idea that the lumber is going to disappear, right? At the time, they still pretty much thought of this as an inexhaustible resource. It was never going to run out. Give it a couple decades and maybe we'll get closer to that idea. But for now, we're still doing okay. There's lots of the great white pinery to harvest yet. But one of the byproducts of that harvesting is the fact that suddenly, as time goes on, there's more and more acres just completely clear cut. These lumberjacks would go out and cut acres and acres and acres of land, and what are you going to do with this land now that it's been stripped of the good wood that has been sent down the river to be turned into something else? Well, the answer that they start to they hit on and they start to promote is agriculture. This is sort of a win-win. On one hand, it's a great use for all of this land. Normally, if you're a farmer and you just buy land and you move onto it, if there's trees all over the place, you got to put a lot of work into cutting them down and making room for your crops and your animals and your household and all of that sort of thing. They've already done the first step there for you. And so by kind of setting this up, you have the establishment of these new farms. It becomes a sort of a location where particularly European, mostly German, but also other ethnic groups as well, are coming in as immigrants to the area specifically to get on the land because they want to make a life for themselves and their families. So that's one aspect here. There's a lot of these sort of subsistence farms that get set up, these homesteads during this time. On the other hand, this is a promising new industry, right? Every community should, we shouldn't rely on having one thing that you do. You should, maybe do lumber, but also have some industry, some manufacturing, some farms. This kind of diversifies the industry here. And so there are also a handful of people in the area who maybe got their money and livelihoods through lumber or something else, but who are at this point looking to maybe develop agriculture as sort of another revenue stream, so to speak. So you have the subsistence homesteaders, and you also have now a whole set of people who are involved in hobby farms. And basically this kind of is one sort of industry that they're trying to promote. They're trying to get people to come here, and also for local people that are already here to see the value in agriculture. And this sort of movement, this sort of attempt by the early leaders here to kind of promote agriculture leads to the creation ultimately of the Marathon County Agricultural Society. That starts in 1867. Excuse me. So yeah, now we have a group of people who are dedicated to doing just that, to promoting agriculture. How do you do that? Well, in the 1860s, you have a fair, right? The fair, basically you raise money and you basically put that up as incentive for people to participate, as awards. So they say, hey, if, anybody who brings in the best sample of, wheat or, the best knitted coat, or whatever these variety of different categories, you can win an award, and that'll bring the farmers to bring in their products, their animals. It'll allow people who weren't farmers that are coming to just, because that's, a fair is a fun place to go to spend an afternoon. That allows them to see the bounty that you can get as a farmer. And then also allows for all these farmers to get together to compare notes, to network, as it were, and find out what works and what doesn't in different places, and how they can be better farmers as well. So it sounds like a bit of a win-win here. The initial problem is, where are you going to have it? You want to have a fair, that's fine, but you need a place to have it. So to address that, Bradbury Plummer and August Keckbush, two Wausau guys who were maybe not farmers, but had sort of dabbled in it and were members of the Agricultural Society, they pitch in to buy about 80 acres of land on the west side of Wausau. This is eventually going to become Marathon Park. We're not quite to that part of the story yet, but just so you can get your bearings here. That's what we're talking about, Marathon Park. At the time, though, it didn't become Marathon Park. It's not a park, it's the fairgrounds. And that's what they do. They do some clearing of the rubble, the moving some stones and, leveling a little track that they can have and some space for people to gather. And in 1868, they have the very first fair for the county of Marathon County. Yeah. So It's only 2 days long. This is essentially like the broadsheet that they would pin up saying, announcing the fair, and then it would go down further and have a list of, here are the different categories that they're putting money out for the best things in these categories, as well as the rules and regulations, who's going to be judging each category, all that stuff that you would need to know. This is sort of the precursor to what you would use today as a premium book, I guess, same kind of idea. It's a premium list at this point. Yeah. So I think it's actually worth getting into the specifics of this fair. It's the first fair, but it's also a pretty good representation of the sort of things that you're going to see over the next decade or two at least, actually kind of through the 1800s altogether. So we're going to actually talk about what did that actually fair look like. So you show up on day one. What do you do? Well, you would register for events. That's basically all day one was. You knew ahead of time, here's the categories. So if you brought your lace work, you could enter, I want to enter class 4 millinery and fancy work for my lace. Hey, I brought my pigs. I'll put, I'd like to register for class number 7, sheep, swine, and poultry. I think most of these are pretty self-explanatory, except for maybe the last 3. Mechanical. Number 9 would be things that were made by people in Marathon County. That weren't in anything else, essentially. So these typically end up being machines, which is where the name comes from, which is like literally machines, like implements that you would use to harvest crops or do the washing or that sort of thing. Interestingly enough, in the first decade or so, this is the category where all photographs would end up. Photographs being kind of an interesting thing because you use a machine to a camera is a machine, so technically that's where they put it. Miscellaneous, number 10, is essentially anything that didn't fit into the rest of the categories. And these typically were things that were not made inherently by people here. So there were some gentlemen who brought their novelty canes that first year. So that was a category here. I don't know what a novelty cane quite is, but it's a thing apparently. The other good example here would be a collection of archaeological artifacts. So someone brought their collection of fossils. So yeah, why not? And then number 11, class number 11 is essentially money that they set aside that didn't fit into any other category. If somebody showed up on day one with a thing, something, I don't think this was ever actually used to my knowledge, so I don't know what that would actually entail, but if somebody brought something that did, like maybe they had some, I don't know, parrot or something, some sort of bird that doesn't quite fit into the rest of them. I guess that maybe they poultry? Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. Basically, they just set aside something so that if somebody showed up for something that they were not, ready for, they didn't have a category ready, but that the organizers of the fair decided should be awarded something, there was a category there that they could use. Like I said, it was never actually used to my knowledge. So you'd find, if you show up on day one, you'd find the person, say, in charge, and you'd say, hey, I would like to enter my X, whatever, into category Y. You'd give your name and your address, and they would write it in the official book. So there you go. There's the leather-bound book that they would write everything in, and away you went. That was day one. Right, pretty simple. For entertainment during the day, they had a demonstration by the Wausau Schützenverein. This is the Wausau, the German sharpshooters, gun club. One of the early, certainly the very early, I guess you'd call it sports, I guess. Yeah, I guess it was a sport back then. So they did some target shooting, they did some trap shooting, and that was the demonstration, and that was the entertainment for day one. Interestingly enough, just kind of briefly here, the Schützenverein has a long history with the Marathon Park, or the area Marathon Park, the fairgrounds. They actually rented about a couple acres in the back and had a little clubhouse, as well as a shooting range. There. I mean, it makes sense. The fairgrounds is 80 acres. It's a lot of space that isn't really being used. And even when it is being used, it's there for, 2 weeks a year, max. So the rest of the time, they have their nice shooting club there. Interesting trivia point here. If you've ever heard those urban rumors that there are Indian burial mounds back in Marathon Park, Well, that's actually all they are. It's just an urban legend. It's not actually true. What it actually is that's the remains of the backstop, these mounds. We don't actually have Native American burial mounds here, at least certainly not in Marathon Park. But if you do go back there and someone tries to tell you, hey, those are burial mounds, now you can set them straight. Actually, that's the backstop of the old shooting club. So that was day one. Day two started off with a speech, sort of mid to late morning, actually two speeches by the sitting secretary, Mr. Silverthorne, and the previous secretary of the Agriculture Society, Charles Hoflinger. They both talked for about 15, 20 minutes or so, and interestingly, both of their speeches were given entirely in German, which gives you a sort of sense of the sort of people who are participating at this event. As soon as that was done, they got the judging. This should be, pretty straightforward. You had these people who were agreed upon as being experts in the category, and they would take a look at the different aspects, inspect the cows, and then decide which one was the best, second best, and so on and so forth. And then they would make their decision. Entertainment during the day, the Wausau Cornet Band was apparently on the scene. This is them in 1872. But, a cornet band, a brass band, again, you can kind of imagine going to a fair back in the 1860s and 70s when there was no electricity, there were no speaker systems or, radios blaring. So it would have been, this would have been the entertainment. They would have wandered around or maybe played a concert for people, but they would have been, walking around adding some musical background to the affair. The big event at day two was certainly the horse race. So the track was given over to the judging of the horses, and naturally you have to see which horse is fastest in order to judge which the best horse is. So they had a race. As you can see, a $25 purse. So in addition to winning the award, and this might have even been a separate category than the actual judging for the horses, but they had a race, and the winner got $25. Which is a lot of money back in the 1860s, as we'll see. Interesting note, this is another really popular, along with the target shooting and trap shooting, the gun play, the sharpshooters. Horse racing is the other big sport at the time in Marathon County. The event here would have been very amateurish. It would have been just the local people bringing their horses and riding it themselves. This is going to change, though, over the next few years. You're going to see the emergence of a fair circuit of, professional racers or maybe quasi-professional racers on horses that were bred and trained to race, going from town to town, which, it makes sense. That's going to be more of an interesting spectator event to see that as well. But yeah, horse races, that's a big reason, a big entertainment for the day at the fair. And then at 4 1/2 o'clock, they awarded the premiums. If you won your category, like Mr. Henry Paff here, he had a sample of the best apples, so he got $3 as an award for his participation. The premiums then went down every 50 cents. This was the highest premium paid, $3. And there's only him. He was the only one that got $3. There were a couple of people who got $2.50, and then from there it went down to 50 cents, such as Mr. Gottlieb Wendorf, and his second place radishes. I think there were about maybe 17 or so people who got 50 cents, and then up to one at $3. In all, there were $182.50 given out in premiums at this first fair. So again, $182.50 versus the $25 for the race. You can kind of see where the real entertainment value was in some regards. So that's the first fair. Because again, 4 1/2 o'clock, not too long after that, the sun's going to go down, so you got to give people time to go home. And so it was a pretty quick fair, but it was very successful. Evidently, there were about 2,000 people who showed up for the fair, according to some accounts. So that's pretty good. They still lost money at the first fair, though, which is going to set sort of a trend going forward, unfortunately. Fairs are not something that you get into to make lots and lots of money. Sometimes you get money, sometimes you lose money. It's hard to plan for that sort of thing, If it turns out that the week of the fair, it's nonstop rain, there's not much you can do about that. But it isn't helped by the way that the county develops during this period. And over the next few years, next decade or so, you're going to see the fair really struggle. Over the course of the 1870s, there's at least 2 years, from what I can tell, that they just couldn't put the fair on. They had to cancel it because they didn't have the funds or whatever reason. So, yeah, it's kind of in trouble, which is really interesting because over the same period, the county is growing really quickly. So to give you an explanation of this, this is the township map of Marathon County in 1868, the year the first fair was held. You can see the dotted lines. If you're not familiar with the township map, essentially this is the area, the non-incorporated, so basically this is the county, and then the areas that would be incorporated as towns or cities or villages, these would be kind of taken out, and this is basically the rest of the county. So a lot of the rural areas, the township is in charge of, maintaining the roads, and, a volunteer fire department usually because you don't want to have to wait for the fire department from Wausau to get all the way, miles and miles away to put out a fire, as well as some other little things here and there. But essentially it's sort of the administration, the county administration of the rural area. So back in 1867, there's not, or 1868, there's not a whole lot here. Like the reason that there are these dotted lines, they should be nice squares. That's what they look like today. And that kind of represents what they're going to be. But at this point, there's nobody living out here, right? So if there's nobody living on the way on the east or the west side, like why divvy up a township if there's nobody, or maybe there's a couple farms there? It's just not worth the effort. But as we see, if we go forward over, about a decade at a time, from 1868 to around 1900, you can see that they change pretty consistently, right? We go from having these long areas, and then you can see as people are moving onto the land, they do divvy it up into smaller chunks to be able to administrate it. And so we go from, what is that, maybe less than a dozen townships in 1868 to, we're getting close to what it looks like today in 1895. And by 1910 at least, it looks very, very similar. Almost everything is exactly what it is today. And basically what this shows us is the fact that, the people that are moving into the center of the town, of the county, those are mostly farmers. Right, that's what people are going out to these areas are doing. So there's this interesting thing, like, okay, well, if over this period, over the 1860s and 70s and 80s, if the county fair, which is supposed to be for the farmers, is struggling, then you'd expect maybe there's not as many farmers. But there are tons, hundreds or thousands of people who are getting into farming over this period. So why isn't the fair doing very well then? Well, there's a couple reasons for this. One, it's a matter of scale. As I said at the beginning, this is the largest county by landmass, right? So in order for you to get from the western side, even to Wausau's right here in the center, right? Over here. So to get over to to Wausau, that's a long way to go. Especially in the 1880s, if you're living in the town of Wien, right? There's not a lot of good roads, and even if there were good roads, what are you going to take, a vehicle? Automobiles aren't really a thing at this point. So horse and buggy all the way, a couple dozen miles to get to Wausau. That's a long way to go. Now, granted, there are going to, by this period, by the end of this, there are going to be railroads that are set up. But that also is not very helpful because a lot of these places, there's not like a direct connection to Wausau. In order to get to Wausau by rail, you have to get on a train and then maybe go down, a couple dozen miles and then back up and, cut across. So it's just logistically very difficult for people, even people that are close to Wausau, people as far as like Mosinee, that's a long way to go at that period, let alone take your animals through that process. So if you're, it's one thing just to go to see the fair. If you're going to go and try to compete, you got to bring your animals or your crops or whatever you're going to participate. That's more difficult. It's also difficult because of the nature of farming that's emerging. So wheat farming, corn farming, if you're doing this sort of thing, it's a lot of work at the beginning, right? You got to plow the fields and put the crops into the field, the seeds and all of that. And then there's a lot of work at the harvest. But in between, there's not terribly much to do. The plants are just growing. So if you're basically if you're a wheat farmer, you could justifiably take a day or two and head to town for a while, right? So you could go off to the fair. But increasingly, we are being, we're a dairy state, right? Wisconsin is the dairy state, and Marathon County that's a lot of what we end up being. So if you're a dairy farmer, it's a lot harder to just walk away from the farm for a few days, because the cows aren't gonna, you have to milk them, you have to feed them, you have to care for them. You can't just let them fend for themselves for a week while you go to Wausau to enjoy the fair. So if you are a dairy farmer, even a dairy farmer close to Wausau, and you wanted to take a couple days or a day or two to go to Wausau for the fair, you'd have to find somebody to watch your animals, or pay them, or maybe get somebody else to owe them a favor, and so that's kind of logistically very difficult to do too. And so this leads us to this period of it's hard to get people to come to the fair in the 1870s and 80s. And until it kind of turns around with a new slate of officers that become on the fair board. In 1882, B.W. Poling becomes the president, and Dr. Trevitt becomes secretary. Particularly Trevitt. Usually it's the secretary because they don't just serve like a 2-year term. They're there for a long time, and they're involved in the planning and operation of the fair. They typically are the ones that really sort of set the tenure for their tenure. So Trevitt takes over Poling and some other people, and they take a look at the situation, and they decide that there's a change that needs to be made. And that change that they do is they are increasingly appealing not to the farmers of the county, who obviously can't get to Wausau. And they look at it and say, well, if we want a successful fair, what we really should be doing is appealing to the people of the city, those city folk in Wausau and Mosinee and Marathon City, people who are going to come for the spectate, to have a good time. And also, for specifically the people of Wausau, like one of the big things they do is they start to go to their friends in the city of Wausau, people who are not normally involved in farming, but they pitch them this idea that, if the fair does well, that means that people are going to be coming to Wausau. And if they come to Wausau, that means that they're going to spend money here. They're going to, that's a good thing for the city of Wausau. It's also going to raise the stature, the prestige of the city by having a successful fair. So it's not just the farms, it's also, the county and the city of Wausau has a lot to gain from a successful farm. So they do that. They get a lot of members, new members, lifetime members to sign on to the fair during this period in the 1880s. People from Wausau who are not, again, normally farmers. They also start to change the way the fair operates. And they do, one big things that shows this is the changes in infrastructure. So this is some changes. Again, like I said at the beginning, they got the fairgrounds, and they laid out a track so they could do some racing, and they maybe cleared off some underbrush and what have you to have some space, but they didn't really do much else. They might have had a shack or two, but that was about the extent of the development of the fairgrounds. But now in the 1880s, specifically in 1886, they go through this big process of building new buildings and infrastructure here. So one thing, the track hadn't really been regulation or graded up to the standards they needed, so they did that, as well as making it a better experience by moving the judging stand, which originally was on the far southeast side, I guess, of the track, and now they moved it over here to the sort of the northern part of the track, opposite this new fancy grandstands. Which hadn't been built. Like, there were no grandstands up to this point. There might have been some bleachers or something, set up for people to watch the races and entertainment, but there really wasn't a grandstand yet. And now there was. Here's another picture of it, again, from the early part of the century, showing an exhibition of an early airplane flight here. But it shows you in the background there, that's the grandstands, the size of it. So it shows you a lot of rows of seats that, they can accommodate more people to enjoy the races and other events. But also importantly, that roof there is really important too. Because now you can go to the fair or to whatever you're attending for the event here, and you're out of the sun. on the hot days. You're out of, if it threatens to rain, you can stay out of the elements that way. So it makes the fair-going experience much better for the spectators that are attending. And then finally, in the back there are a couple buildings that get built. This in the white building, there's the new exhibition building that they build. So this is a place, again, so if we think about like what the experience of bringing something to the fair to show in the 1860s and the 70s would have been like, there were no buildings, right? So you'd show up on day one and say, hey, I have this fancy quilt that I made, or I have this baking that I did. And they would say, great, bring it tomorrow. And maybe as they become more than one day of the fair, what are you going to do with that? Are you just going to leave it out in the fairgrounds under a tent, maybe? That's not ideal. And also, it's not a great, once you get to the actual judging and the affair itself, having a building like this not only gives it a place for all of this to happen, but it allows for the presentation of it. You can have booths that are set up. They're sort of, it's not just, here's my thing. Now they can kind of contextualize it and add more stuff. This is sort of the era in which you start to see, local organizations and companies put their booths to do things as well as just the part of the judging. And then also you have the judging barns. Similar idea, that having a barn to put your animals in, that goes a long way to convincing people to bring their animals. Because again, before that, you would have to, figure out where you were going to house your cows during the night, over in between days, and leave them out in the fields. That's not a great idea for people. So now we have a secure place for that all to take place too. So that's great. To pay for this, in part, this is when the railroad goes through along the edge there. The Chicago Northwestern Railroad goes in. They sell this little strip of land for about $1,000. Which helps to pay for some of this infrastructure, which is not cheap to put on. So now we're going to jump ahead a bit from 1886, give or take, to 1920-21, because this is the next big thing that happens in the infrastructure of the fair. They have the infrastructure. They're successfully able to get the people of Wausau and city people who aren't farmers to come. That helps to get people to come and show their animals. It's one of those interesting things that this is the step that broke that cycle, where the farmers don't want to commit to bringing their animals and their products to the fair unless it's a successful fair. And it can't be a successful fair unless the farmers bring their stuff to the fair. So there's this sort of cycle that is difficult to break out of, but they finally do that. They have a successful fair, and they just kind of, chug along for another couple decades. But by 1920, they hit a point where they can no longer keep doing that. Because those buildings had not been replaced in 40 years, and these were, decent buildings in the 1880s, but by the late teens, they were getting in rough shape. There are stories about how farmers decided to not bring their animals in at this point because they knew if they put them in the barns, which had become so unsanitary, that they probably would not live to get back onto the farm. They'd probably get sick and die. So if they brought an animal, they brought their, not their best, which isn't ideal for the fair. Similarly, the grandstands were so badly beat up and in such disrepair that by 1920, the government came in and said, this is not safe. They condemned the structure and had it razed. So at this point, they kind of knew about this, the Fair Board did. They knew that there was going to need to be some replacements in the near future. And they kept kicking that can along because, 1919, say, World War I is over. There's this exuberance. People go out to the fair. It's a big celebration. It's the most well-attended fair in the history of Marathon County fairs. And they still lost, I think actually maybe they gained about $100 at the end of it. But they were still about $1,000 in debt. So that's not a great, you do the math there, that's going to take a while for them. Assuming that, they have another decade of decent, fairs at the same level, they're really only going to be able to break even in about a decade. And in the meantime, they cannot, all these buildings now come to a point where they have to be replaced. So this all leads them to a situation where the solution that they come up with is they pitch the idea of turning this into a park, a county park. The Marathon County Board of Supervisors in April of 1920 had created a park commission for the county to identify, potential places to create a county park. And so in they pitch it in 1920, they don't accept it until 1921, but they do accept it in 1921. The county accepts the offer from the Agriculture Society to donate the fairgrounds to become the first of the county park system. So that happens in 1921. It's not completely just here, take this. There are some conditions that are pretty important. For one, we have to keep having the fair here. So you have to guarantee that we'll be allowed to have the fair for a week every year here at the fairgrounds, now the park. Number two, you have to keep it a park. In 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, you can't, if the county is running into financial difficulties, you can't piece it out and commercialize it and sell it. It needs to remain, this bastion of natural beauty in this area and remain as a park. And then number three, please replace these buildings that are in desperate need of replacing. So that's what they do. They build the new grandstands. They bring in an architect by the name of Alexander Eschweiler from Milwaukee, who's done quite a few things here in the area, and he designs this grandstand made out of concrete and steel, which is great. It not only replaces the old grandstand, but builds upon it and makes it into something that's going to be better suited for the sort of entertainment that we're going to have here. Especially, for example, once we get into the 30s, more often you're seeing nighttime events here because you have electricity that they can light the area. That makes it much more appealing to come, and it seats quite a few more people as well. New barns. Right, this is the new judging stock pavilion there. So this geometric shape, which is pretty unique. Again, an Eschweiler design, as well as some barns on the side. That was 1921. Over the next few years, there are going to be additional developments. I should say also, around the same time, they're doing things like they're finally getting around to clearing the undergrowth that had been growing for the last few decades that they really hadn't kept up on. They set down paths, granite to create paths across the park so people could enjoy that. They turned the old pond into a wading pool. So they were making other improvements as well. In 1924, they added the bandstand, the new band shell there, as well as the new the exhibition building. Which I'm sure if you've been to Marathon Park, this is maybe the most iconic building, certainly at the park. Maybe honestly, it might be the most iconic building in Marathon County. It's definitely up there in terms of its unique architecture and the role that it's played over the course of these years. So again, it's a nice place. It's an opportunity for exhibition. You can exhibit things and these nice long wings and sort of have events there too. So in 1921, this is a big deal for the fair. They've finally gotten out of this cycle of being in debt. Not only are they not in debt, now they have money to actually spend on promoting the fair. And so as part of that, they changed the name. Previously, we had been the Marathon County Fair. There was a brief time where they tried to go with the Clover Fair. That didn't quite fit, or Clover Belt Fair. That didn't really take off. Now we're rebranding it as the Wisconsin Valley Fair and Exhibition. Now, obviously, these days we don't really say the exhibition part, that's kind of been dropped. But Wisconsin Valley Fair, that I think is a great indication of the ambitions that they have for this event. Right, the Wisconsin Valley Fair. We're not just a fair for Marathon County. Now we're the fair for the whole Wisconsin Valley, and along with that, they expand the amount of time. They add more entertainment, and it becomes very successful going forward. Now, I think it's interesting to maybe step back now. We've talked about there's not a whole lot of changes that have taken place. I mean, we'll get to some of them here in terms of the infrastructure after that point. But it might be good to step back and talk about what was the fair-going experience like in various aspects. So let's talk about the entertainment. It had become, by the turn of the century, this is about 1908, 1910, it has become sort of it's not quite the same as it once was. It's not just having a bunch of sharpshooters, show their ability to shoot a gun, and maybe a brass band wandering around. It has become an event, spectacle unto itself, and even like carnival-like in many ways, right? You have trained animals, seals here. There are other years where they'll have horses, elephants, bears. I want to say there's a camel one year, at least one year. So trained animals doing things on the grandstand here is sort of an act on their own, as well as on the midway. Same thing with acrobats, contortionists, jugglers, comedians. People wandering around, doing that, as well as acts like this. They would also bring in death-defying acts, things like this. This is a great picture. This is if you can't tell, this is a guy on a scaffolding, right, on a ramp showing down above the grandstands. At the very top, there's a gentleman on a bicycle. And once everybody had gathered, and gotten ready, he would then get on the bicycle and ride it down the ramp and catch himself on a net. So interesting there. Another great example of this sort of, in this same vein, I want to say it was the late 40s or early 50s. They brought over a French daredevil, an aerialist, who stood before the crowd. At least this was his shtick. He would stand in front of the crowd at the grandstands, and he would be put into a straitjacket. And then the straitjacket would be, chained together. His feet would be manacled together. The manacles then would be chained to the bottom of an airplane, which would then take off, and they'd push him off, and he'd dangle from the airplane as it circled around the venue. And as people stood up there watching him dangling, he would break out of the straitjacket and pull himself to safety. Some interesting stuff. Like, where else are you going to see something like that? This is, exhibitions are kind of interesting. We talked a little bit about them, right? The exhibition building allowed for a presentation. And so now you start to see people bring in, booths. They rent booths. They pay for a booth where they, a local company will say, hey, this is a great opportunity to get all these people here, especially if you're trying to get to farmers, right? When else are all the farmers in the county going to be in one place? So this is a great time to show, here's the latest fashions in the shoe shop that you can go. So if you need to do some shopping for shoes for your kids or for your family while you're here in town, you know where to go. Again, things, farm implements and things dedicated to farmers, local companies, organizations. Same thing as today, like if you go into the exhibition building at the fair in 2020, maybe 2021, if the fair still happens this year, who knows. But you will see the Marathon County Historical Society. We have a booth where we show historic pictures and things like that. Different organizations, the political parties, the Republicans and Democrats have booths. Interestingly, sometimes politics was allowed and sometimes it was banned from the fair. That's kind of a whole other thing. But yeah, you want to see the latest. Department store has their appliances or their different kinds of bread or beer. Breweries would come be there. That's all that happened here. But increasingly, it's also by the turn of the century, it's also being on the midway. So you have all of these. You can see on the right side all of these tents that are being set up. Some of these are set up by local people. Sometimes they're people who come through for the fair. Here's a couple good examples. We know from 1908 that there were these are all people that are at the fair. There's Madame Olive, who has a tent there. She was a psychic who would read your palm and tell you how you would get great fortune in your future. Not pictured here, but at this was a merry-go-round, which they brought over from New London. There's also another tent over there in the background there, kind of off to the side, owned by C.S. Cohn, who is a band leader and the proprietor of the Grand Opera House here in town. And he also was the first person to have a film projector. So he would come to the fair and set up a tent where you pay admission, depending on how long of a film, a nickel or a dime, and you'd get to sit and watch a movie that he would project for you. Also, I don't know if they're in this picture, but there were events like acts like they had a fat boy. here, obese boy, a man who had no arms but would marvel people by using his toes and legs to thread needles and shoot shotguns. There was carts of ice cream, which would have been kind of a delicacy and an unusual treat at that point. One thing is they just left it, just basically they said a cart of snakes, which, okay, sure, yeah, why not? So lots of interesting stuff. Again, kind of a weird grouping of things. As we go forward, increasingly the Midway is going to be populated by rides and games and booths that are brought in by the carnival. They hired out a carnival who would provide all of this. Rides are not necessarily new. They had a merry-go-round by the turn of the century, although maybe not quite a merry-go-round like we would see it today, but something similar. And they had Ferris wheels by late teens, early 20s. But obviously, it's become a more iconic and important part of the fair as well. And certainly you still have, the food vendors and things that are put on by local churches or, clubs, who will sell elephant ears or popcorn or something like that, beer tents. So there's more than just that as well. But obviously it's changed quite a bit over the intervening period. Let's talk about music. As we said at the very first fair, there was a cornet band, a brass band. And that certainly continued throughout the era, at least in the 20th century. Here's Mr. B.F. Schultz's Columbia Band at the fair around 1910. And yeah, they would walk around through the Midway playing music just like they did in the early years. Here they are playing as part of the entertainment at the races. They would have a spot where they would get out and play music to entertain people while in between heats of the racing, as well as maybe sit-down concert or two. So yeah, this local brass bands, local commercial bands were certainly very popular. They brought in groups too, like this is the Edgar Community Band. Interestingly, Mr. C.S. Cohn here in white, he's the guy who would, 20 years earlier was bringing in the film projector for his tent, but now he's got a band here, the Community Band of Edgar, as well as the Lady Saxophone Band, which is its own fascinating story that I won't get into here. But he also had, the Colby 4-H Band and bands from Athens and local communities were bringing their musical talents here as well. Maybe the biggest example of this is our local municipal band, which had been the 128th Infantry Band, the military band here, which during World War I they kind of transitioned to a civilian group, and this is them. Today they're known as the Wausau Concert Band. I should say the asterisks there. I've been corrected. This is not the actual Wausau Municipal Band. This is Irv Hanerfuss's band, which is apparently like a second stringers. These were guys who, if they needed two groups for a parade, the municipal band would go out, first, and then some of the guys would, take off the suit jacket and put on the hat, and then they would run back to the front and then jump in to Hanerfuss's band. But basically the same sort of core group here, probably, and it's a great, fair picture. So, but yeah, the municipal band. These sort of groups would play at the fairgrounds, playing music for people walking by. Again, before electricity provided us the way to play music out of speakers that are blaring all the time. This is kind of that, as well as concerts themselves. But eventually we get into a situation where, at the same time as that's happening, in the early 20th century, you start to see entertainment of a different sort. This is the Sensations of 1950. This is sort of a running group, sort of a variety show that would show up at the fair as part of the acts that were brought in as part of the carnival, usually. And so, you had the Sensations of 1930 and 1931 and 32, and they would come on and, costume changes and music numbers and put on a show at the grandstands. So you had acts like this. You also had, again, as part of that entertainment that was brought in, there was also music involved along with the jugglers and the contortionists and acrobats and stuff like that. Great example of that in 1921 for the first Wisconsin Valley Fair. They brought in an act that was dubbed the Scottish Lasses. And these were young ladies from Scotland, presumably, who would play bagpipes and sing songs. So you had that sort of thing happening too. But in the early 50s, you start to see a shift in sort of the way that music is considered as part of the fair. Up until this point, this is, maybe the Sensations is maybe an attraction, but it's not really the main reason that you'd go there for most people. To hear the band play, that's great, but, that's often, the music is sort of a thing to entertain people at the fair. But now they're going to start thinking of the fair as needing entertainment to bring people to the fair, right? So this kind of, maybe the turning point here is the appearance of Gene Autry in 1952, the singing cowboy, the star of the television and movies, the cowboy era that was very popular. But yeah, he came here, he played some music along with his sidekick Tag Oakley, and his horse Champion were all here. And this marks sort of an interesting change. Again, sort of bringing in a name that's recognizable, a name from television, movies, or increasingly, as we'll see, country music does pretty well at the fair too. And so if we jump a couple years later, for example, in 1970, two of the big acts that were at the fair were the stars of the Lawrence Welk Show, very popular, television show that, played popular music at the time. And then they had Festus from Gunsmoke. And I should note that Ken Curtis, the actor who played Festus, was a really talented singer in his own right. Back in 1941, he had actually replaced Frank Sinatra in the Tommy Dorsey Band for a few months. So, certainly an accomplished singer and an act in his own right. But notably, they did not bill him as a Frank Sinatra-style crooner. They billed him as Festus from Gunsmoke, which kind of shows the sort of angle that they're trying to attract people. And like I say, country music certainly becomes a big part of the fair. For better or worse, it's very popular with fairgoers as that sort of genre emerges in the middle of the century. It becomes what it is today. This is just a smattering of examples of people who have played the fair here at least 2 times, the return people. There's certainly a long list of people that you could point to for this sort of genre. And I guess it makes a little sense. I think country music, not only is it popular with a lot of the fairgoers over the years and the organizers, certainly, it also, I think, as a genre, fits the fair environment pretty well. I think, getting a fusion jazz combo to play the fair wouldn't really work, or a punk rock underground stick it to the man kind of music. It doesn't quite fit the environment of a county fair as well as country music and sort of associated genres. But eventually, they do decide, the organizers of the fair do decide that maybe it's worth looking into non-country acts, because certainly by the 1970s, that was what it was. It was just country music. To their credit, they did try some rock and roll before this point, but in 1978, the early attempts, sort of regional groups, didn't really do very well at the box office. But in 1978, as they're getting ready for the fair, they decide, maybe we should reevaluate this and bring in a nationally known, an international, well-known rock and roll group for the teenagers. Because obviously teenagers love this rock and roll, and it seems to be sticking around. Again, 1978, because it's time that we finally get around with the times and we get some rock and roll. So they go out and they book a renowned, like a recognizable name, a nationally known name, a rock group, and they start to get kind of concerned. The minutes of the fair board meeting leading up to the actual fair where they have this, has concerns where some of the members are saying, we should make sure that there's extra police security there, because what kind of people show up at rock and roll concerts? People with, violence and drugs and sex and rock, we don't want that sort of people to be here. We want to make sure that they're, ready in case we need them. So let's have some extra security at the fair, which they do. And ultimately, I don't know, personally looking back, it seems kind of strange because the group, if you're thinking about what group would elicit such concerns in 1978 about rock and roll and, bad people following the group, you're probably not thinking of the actual group, which was Sha-Na-Na, which is a 1950s style doo-wop revival kind of music. Granted, there's certainly an element of, these guys did play at Woodstock and did have a following, but in terms of the really scared, like, ooh, we got to be concerned, I don't know if they really fit that bill. But anyway, that's what happened. Ultimately, this became the most successful act that they've ever had at the fair up to that point. And so by the end of the 70s, they relent and they start bringing in some rock and roll, or maybe not rock and roll, but, non-country music acts. And so as we go through the 80s and 90s and 2000s, we tend to see at least one non-country act as part of the billing. And again, I tried to pick some examples of non-country music acts that played multiple times. There's certainly a longer list as well, although not as long as the country music. So that's kind of where we're at today. Again, if you go to the fair now, you're probably going to see some country acts on the bill, but, they try to make sure that there's at least one for fans of other genres as well. So another aspect here that we need to talk about is racing. As we saw, racing was a really big part of the early fairs as these sort of amateur, bring your horses and see who can run the fastest. That turns into these circuits over the course of the 1800s, and that certainly picks up into the new century. One thing kind of interestingly is they often have foot races as part of the racing. Even either as its own event, sort of like a track and field almost, or as sort of spur of the moment decisions of, okay, we're waiting for the next race, the heat to start. Let's just get some audience members who can run the 100 meters fastest, and they would just do that. But that's maybe not quite serious. The big one though that emerges is harness racing. In the early years of the century, about mid-teens, I think, is when they first start appearing here in Marathon County. Harness racing is the really replaces the horse and jockey type, the jockey on top of the horse type racing that you would see. Basically, it's the same kind of idea, except instead of being on top of the horse, the rider is behind the horse, and then they have wheels and a little harness that's attached to the back, and that's how they would go. That's harness racing. It becomes really popular throughout the 20s, 30s, and becomes sort of the big thing. But it's not the only thing, because at the same time, they are occasionally getting into motorcycle races, which again kind of fits the theme. It fits this track very well, right? The dirt track motorcycles are sort of new, and certainly motorcycles, maybe not ever like the main act, the main races for the year, but they make their appearances here and there throughout the rest of the century, for that matter. Then you have sort of, again, kind of dipping their toes into the idea of automobiles and combustion engines. They would have auto polo. The world's most thrilling sport is what it was billed as. So what is auto polo? It's a good question. Basically, it's not a great picture here, but essentially there are two teams. Each team has a automobile, car, that's been sort of stripped down to be very lightweight and maneuverable. And then on each of the teams, on top of the automobiles, you have two people. One, a driver, and then you have a person scrambling around the outside of the car with a mallet, a croquet mallet, essentially. And these teams then tried to compete to hit a ball to one side of the field or another. Which, if it sounds a little dangerous to be using automobiles to do this, that's because it was. Thus, the most thrilling sport in the world, evidently. They started doing this at early 20s until at least the 40s. There's about 20 years where they would have this as an event. Part of this sort of era in which they're experimenting with automobiles as sort of the racing. They don't know if it can completely take over. They haven't quite figured out the format. But they would do exhibitions like auto polo, like having an airplane race a automobile to see who could go around the track 3 times fastest. They did stuff like that in this era. But eventually, automobiles become popular enough and widespread enough that they do start having races themselves. Initially as Whippets, which is kind of a style. Whippets are also a specific make of car, which these are not. But these are kind of the general style of the Whippets that were popular at the time. So those get used. Eventually, we get into more cars built for racing, midget cars, as well as the stock or big cars. Now this continues, by the 1940s, this becomes the main big event, becomes incredibly popular, and they actually replace the harness racing and horse racing altogether. That was something that was completely phased out by the end of the 40s in favor of these car races.
And this continues for about 40 years, but by the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s, I can't remember the specific date off the top of my head. I can never remember if it's one or the other. But by the end of the 70s, they're having more and more trouble justifying keeping the races up and running. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, it was not as popular as it had been years earlier. Two, although it was still pretty popular, it was expensive. There was a lot of work that needed to go into making the track regulation in order to have them race here. And then once the races happened, then you have to repair them every year. Even if there was no wrecks or dangerous things that caused damage, to the infrastructure, these cars were getting more powerful and faster, and so they would rip up the track, and that was a lot of work that needed to be put into it to keep them, able to race. And then there's also, safety concerns. They were having to pay a lot of money in insurance, like liability insurance and things like that. These cars, again, really powerful and fast, they're not that far from the spectators. So I don't think there was ever like a major issue where people died in large numbers because of a crash. But that's not making it. And that combined with all these other things about the difficulties and the financial burden of putting on the races, they decided to phase that out by the 80s. But interestingly enough, they continued to hold the races, and they return of the harness racing. Harness racing had been brought back in 1968 as part of the the Centennial Fair, the 100th anniversary, and ultimately they kept it around. It was originally sort of like, hey, remember these? And then they were popular enough, and they weren't very expensive to do relative to other forms of racing. So yeah, they kept it up through, I think, I'm pretty sure 1989 was the last year that this happened, because eventually, it wasn't popular enough to keep justifying maintaining it. And ultimately, shortly thereafter, in 91, 92, they just removed the track altogether. So that's racing. Also worth noting that there had been other by this point, demolition derbies had become sort of the replacement for racing in some ways, and you don't need a track for that. Other miscellaneous entertainment. So real quickly, I just kind of want to sum up a bunch of other stuff. The fair, I think if we can kind of sum up the entertainment at the fair, there are some things that are going to make the regular appearances, and that changes over the years, as we've seen with the music and the racing and things like that. But there's also, they would just throw in an event some years, right? They would get to the point where, maybe some a member of the fair board, had gone to a fair, in a neighboring county and come back and said, what they have over there that we should try? Watermelon seed spitting contests. Let's try that. Or let's have an exhibition baseball game. Let's have a rodeo. That sounds fun. Let's have a rodeo or a dance or things like that. There's one year where they decided for some reason to put on a production of the Thornton Wilder play, Our Town. So that's just kind of the way the fair operates. These do not make regular appearances. They don't become regular traditions where every year they have, a local production of Our Town. Sometimes they do. Sometimes, for a while, they had a talent show where community members could, put on a part of the show. That lasted for a few years, but it wasn't like a long-term thing. And these sort of things would pop up. I think it's one of the big strengths of the fair that, they're willing to try something. Hey, some fairs might have success with an arcade, so let's try putting an arcade in there. And then it doesn't really work out, so they don't bring it back. And I think maybe that also adds to the appeal of the fair. What's going to be at the fair this year? Well, you got to go and find out, because you may never be able to experience it again. We never will have an exhibition baseball game here at the fair. But there was a year where they did, So there you go. So finally, I think we need to wrap up with agriculture. Agriculture, after all, was the reason that the fair exists in the first place. We promote agriculture. And all this other stuff had been tacked on over the years to make it profitable, but, we haven't lost sight of that goal to promote agriculture. And particularly that sort of idea of education, right? And sort of, it's going to remind you from the beginning here, and maybe get into more specifics, there's a sort of 19th century mentality that they come out of that with farm education. They said that, for example, this quote where one of the secretaries was talking about the purpose of the fair for to the county board. They said that the county fair is an annual event designed to bring together the farmers of our county, and by offering sufficient premiums to induce them to place their stock and produce of all kinds on display, and thus create an interchange of ideas to the end that conditions in stock raising and agriculture may be improved until the highest perfection possible is attained. So basically, that's that idea of if you put money up, people are going to want to get that money. They're going to want to win that award, that premium. And so they're going to bring their best examples of animal stock raising and produce. And then just by bringing people together and pitting them against each other in this sort of way, it's going to lead to people wanting to do better, and also give them an opportunity to talk to other farmers. When they can say, hey, that's really great, pumpkin that you grew. What kind of soil did you put in that? How did you fertilizer, or, what, all that sort of stuff, right? Do you have Guernseys or do you have Holsteins on your, okay, and then you can strike up a conversation and compare notes and figure out how to do better as a whole. The problem with this, well, there's maybe two big problems. One, it is very self-directed. It's in the best interest of the farmer to do this, but the farmer maybe doesn't want to go over and talk to their neighbor in the next booth and ask them what they do about, fertilizer for their pumpkins. So if they don't want to do it, this doesn't really work. The other problem is it relies on that knowledge to already be here. If there's a problem that they all face and that none of them have a solution, getting together and talking about it isn't necessarily going to be the solution. Get that solution. But this starts to change. So what's going to happen is there's going to be a sort of change in the attitudes of the fair in terms of the role of education and farm education. And it starts with club work. In the turn of the century, in the early years of the turn of the century, there is a big movement for organizing around clubs. There were garden clubs, there were, canning clubs, cow raising, horse racing, all these sort of clubs that would often at the grassroots, neighborhoods, townships would kind of get together and create a club for the kids. But not only kids, they had organizations and clubs for women, for men who were raising, Holstein cows, the Breeders Association. This is sort of an organization that's being used all over the place. But specifically the kids are interesting because this is going to create the sort of basis for what's going to be reorganized as under the university system. The University of Wisconsin kind of co-opts this, like other states had been doing, to organize, in this case, the 4-H. This is 1929, so this is a few years after 4-H becomes a thing, and there are already over 1,000 people, kids participating in Marathon County, and that number is only going to get more. So 4-H, again, kind of grow on the back of these sort of grassroots clubs. 4-H is an opportunity. It's sort of a program where kids can get together with other kids and, learn how to do things, hands-on experience some. How do you raise a cow? Well, here's a calf, raise it. And we'll help you along and you can learn from that. But it's sort of a project that they can actually do and then ultimately show off. And naturally the natural place for that sort of culmination of these projects ends up being the fair. Right? So you have the adult categories, the open fair, and increasingly now there's the junior categories. It's kind of interesting to see, if you look at the premium books for the Wisconsin Valley Fair, in the 20s, they have these categories, here's the chapter that's dedicated to, neat cattle and horses and as you go on. And then towards the back, there's a women's category, women's work, and then there's the juvenile category. And as we go forward in time, year by year, that category, the juvenile category, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And certainly by the 1980s, that becomes the thing, right? Today, if you look at the premium book, more than half of it, if not more, is dedicated to the junior fair. And that's because, 4-H, again, it's an opportunity for them to get together and show off what they did. They get the opportunity to learn by doing, and also get the feedback and be able to say, hey, I won the blue ribbon for the cow that I did. Getting to meet Senator Chilton there. Great. And it's not just, animals. It is very much farm-based because, that's kind of the goal here. The goal of 4-H and similar groups like Future Farmers of America has a lot to do with, this philosophy of we want to have people to be on the farms in the future. We don't want kids to not want to be farmers and leave and go find a job in the city someplace. We want them to stay on the farm. We need them to stay on the farm, otherwise the farms are going to disappear. Well, in order to do that, the better way to do that, rather than keep them on the farm and force them to be there, why don't we try to instill in them a love of farming at a young age? If you grow up wanting to be a farmer because you think it's a great thing to do and you want to do it, well then when you become an adult and you become a farmer, you're going to be more likely to seek out, become a better farmer and stick with it. At least that's the philosophy. And of course, 4-H is not just farmers. It has evolved to have the urban 4-H and other things, dog shows and other programs. So you don't have to be a farmer in order to be part of it, but that certainly becomes the basis of this. And again, it's not just about raising animals. They have categories for fashion and art and dollhouses, arranging things like that. And this all kind of gets back to and what we're going to end here with the concept of a balanced fair. This is something that Burt Walters, who was the secretary in the 20s and I think early 30s, he kind of put forth as, it was one of these explanations to the county board of a report that they gave. He said that we are unanimous in the conviction that 4-H club work must continue as the basic foundation around which other features of the fair shall be built. So the idea here is, yes, again, we're going to have the music, we're going to have the midway and the rides and the cotton candy and the elephant ears. We're going to have some races. That's all necessary. But all that's going to be built around and to support the 4-H club work, the agriculture. That's what we're here for. That's what the society, the agriculture society is dedicated to. It's what it's become by this point. And so that's what's important. And this is a philosophy that I don't know if they would still think of it in terms of this concept of a balanced fair, but certainly the idea behind it is still very much alive and well at the fair. So, and you can kind of see this. It's kind of interesting if we look briefly here. If we look at the different categories that got $1, $2, and $3 at the 1868, the first fair. If we adjust that for inflation to see what we'd expect that to be, $17, $34, and $51. Now, if we actually look at what we got in 2018, 150 years later, it didn't really keep up with inflation, which is what else hasn't, right? Inflation isn't necessarily something that's kept up everywhere, but I think in general, this is not necessarily because of inflation. I think this is because a shift in terms of why the fair exists. Today, we don't need, you don't show at the fair in order to get the money, right? It's not the money being put up as premiums is not the reason why you show at the fair. You show at the fair because you want the experience. You want, and especially kids, right? If kids, they don't really need, that pocket money to the same extent. It's part of the 4-H, it's part of that experience, and it's about the ribbon, it's about the experience, it's about the prestige of saying, yes, I showed at the fair and I got, a blue ribbon, or whatever placing that you got. So yeah, I think what this all, to kind of bring it all back together and about the whole thing, if there's anything else you take away from this, the fair is something that has been a big part of the lives here of Marathon County, for the last 150 plus years now. It's also changed quite considerably. The fair is not some archaic, here's what it is, and we're always going to do it the same way. They'll try, a water seed spitting contest or a production of a Thornton Wilder play. They'll try getting somebody to fly around the outside of above the fairgrounds with a straitjacket dangling. That's something that is, it's always a changing thing.
and they're evolving with the time. And I think, the question of what's the future of the fair going to look like? It's a good question. And I think looking back, you can kind of say it's always going to be here in some capacity, but it's going to change. Recently, it's funding is becoming more difficult to get. People aren't going out to the fair in the same way that they used to a generation ago. So are we going to still have the big name acts, the music acts? Are we still going to have, all of this sort of pomp and circumstance surrounding the fair? Who knows? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I say this now in 2020 when everything's closed and everything's being canceled because of the pandemic. Who knows? Maybe we won't even have a fair in 2020. That remains to be seen. But I think what we will see is that it will evolve and it will change with the times to represent the community that it's part of. So there you go. That's the presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I guess if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them and enjoy seeing those. That's the thing you're supposed to say on videos, right, on the internet? Yeah. Thanks for watching.